Okay, I think that we can start. Welcome, everyone. And thank you for coming to this very last session of the Dialogue in European Jain Studies Connecting Around the Globe series. I am joined by my colleagues Tina Wegmans from Ghent and Chris Miller from the Arihanta Institute. So we have collaborated to develop this speaker series to support and advance the dialogue between the contributor of the latest research in Jain studies. And we are really pleased that you came tonight or this morning for the last event of the season on new research in Jain studies. So today we have a wonderful lineup of speakers, 5 young and promising scholars from our field. And before I hand it over to my colleague Tine, who is going to introduce our wonderful Egali presider, just one small housekeeping remark. So there is a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So you can put your questions for the speakers here during the presentations. And we will read all of your questions at the very end of the presentations during a Q&A session. And so I think all that I needed to say is said. So now I'm giving the floor to you, Tina, to introduce our presider. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marie-Hélène. It is a pleasure to be here again and to see all of your lovely, enthusiastic faces. It is also a pleasure to introduce our presider, Professor John Cort, who is by now Professor Emeritus. That means he's done a really good job, of religion at Denison University, where he's taught in a number of programs over the years. He is the author and editor of many a book and many an article on religion, history, literature, society, different aspects of Jainism. I'm sure that his work has helped a lot of us over the years to make sense of all things Jain. Most recently, and of note, is his co-editing of the Brill Encyclopedia of Jainism, together with the late Paul Dundas, Knut Jakobsen and Kristi Wiley. He's been unfailingly supportive and generous to a lot of researchers, especially junior researchers over the years. So his name kind of automatically popped up when we were discussing having this session. So John, I think I will first hand it over to you, to give a bit of an introduction to the event, and then you can come back to me to present the first presenter.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Tina, for those kind comments. And yeah, it's a real pleasure to sort of oversee or moderate or preside over, or whatever I'm doing, this panel of 5 younger scholars, junior scholars. I was going to say PhD candidates, except Achyut is beyond that. And I think looking over what you're going to be hearing today represents the breadth of kinds of interests that people are having. We're going to have a paper on goddesses, one on pilgrimage, one on yoga, one on soteriology, and one on ethics. So we have people who are dealing with material culture, with visual culture, with narrative culture, all sorts of sources there. We have things from medieval, early modern, and modern Jainism. So a wide array of subjects that I think is part of what makes Jain studies interesting, is it's not pigeonholed into just one discipline or one approach or one area or things like that. But before we get going, on a more serious note, I'd like to just take a minute to reflect on the loss in our field last week with the death of Johannes Bronkhorst, retired from Lausanne, over there in Switzerland, where Chris is. And he was somebody that I had known from my very earliest days in the tradition. He was, actually slightly elder to me. And I think something that Johannes represented, several things in his scholarship. One was, it was always insightful, always provocative, always asking interesting questions. You might not agree with everything he wrote. Most people didn't. There were things they might disagree, but it forced you to think through the material at a basic level that you hadn't necessarily thought through. And in fact, I would call your attention to his most recent publication in the Jain materials. Peter, in his newsletter, a magazine, International Journal of Jain Studies, just recently published Johannes's probably last article on the Jains, The Early History of Jainism. And I keep rereading it. It raises a zillion questions that are important for all of us. And so I recommend that. And the other thing just that I think is important for us to think about with looking at the work of someone like Johannes is he was not a Jain scholar. He was a scholar of ancient early India, and he worked equally in Jain materials, Buddhist materials, Brahmanical materials, both Vedic and then later into the philosophical schools. And he reminds us that the strength of Jain studies has been precisely not allowing ourselves to be ghettoized into some tiny little field where there are 12 people around the world who care about it and everyone else sort of lets us do our thing. But we try and reach out and make connections historically, socially, culturally with other traditions at the time, in the same place, across time, sort of indicating why the study of the Jains is important for the study of South Asia, the study of religion, the study of anthropology, the study of history, all of these fields, and then letting them come back into our study of the Jains so that we are reminded that the Jains have never existed by themselves, but always in larger settings. And his work exemplifies that. And, I think is worth, if you haven't read his material, read it. And if you have read it, go back and look at some of his things, especially his most recent article. And so if we could just stop for a minute of silence in memory of Johannes and others of our colleagues that we have lost over the last year. And then I'm done with my comments, and Tina, you can then pick it up.
All right. Thank you very much, John. We have lost another great name in our field in the broadest sense. And it is good to kind of stand still and reflect on what we have learned and what great things we could gain from him. For today, it is again my great honor to present another speaker. I was very happy to present Professor John Cort, and I'm at least equally happy to present our first speaker, Maja Sevenant, who holds a MA degree in Oriental Languages and Cultures from Ghent University. So she's one of ours. She is an Indologist, classically trained at the beginning of her academic career, interested in South Asian goddess traditions. Currently, she specializes, and she's worked on this throughout her BA and her MA, in Jain goddess worship, specifically the worship traditions of Jwalavanini and Sachika. Her broader interests include Sanskrit literature, iconography, and the interactions between Hindus and Jains that shaped South Asian goddess traditions. She has for us today a presentation titled Fierceness and ahiṃsa embodied by Jain goddesses, which very interestingly reflects the discrepancy and the tensions that are evident within these goddess traditions. So Maja, you have the floor. Enjoy and enlighten us.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. I will try to share my screen first. Is this clear for you? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Hello, everyone. And again, thank you for the introduction, Tine, and for having me today. So the topic of my talk is Fierceness and Ahiṃsa embodied by Jain goddesses. More specifically, I want to investigate how the Jain identity of fierce goddesses is given shape through narratives within Jain worship traditions. I approached two fierce goddesses as case studies. One of them is Jwalamalini and the other goddess is Sachika. Despite their different backgrounds, Jwalamalini and Sachika share a fierce iconography that clearly relates to the Mahishasura-Mardini iconography, known from the Hindu traditions. So this is the goddess with several arms holding weapons, slaying the buffalo demon. I want to explore how this fierce depiction was incorporated into a Jain context without conflicting the fundamental principle of ahiṃsa. And with this research project, I hope to gain more insight regarding the versatility of Jain traditions and the dynamic nature of South Asian goddesses. So let me first briefly introduce both goddesses to you. Jwalamalini's worship tradition is situated in Karnataka in South India. This area is known as the religious center of the Digambara traditions during the medieval period. Jain writings confirm that Jwalamalini exclusively appears within Digambara traditions as the attendant deity of the eighth Tirthankara named Chandraprabha. So typically, the attendant deities of Tirthankaras are yakshis. Such goddesses are closely related to the worldly and daily life of people. So devotees approach yakshis for their worldly concerns like health issues, family affairs, financial success, etc. In the region of present-day Karnataka, 3 yakshis gained popularity during the medieval times, namely Padmavati, Ambika, and Jwalamalini. As a result of Jwalamalini's growing popularity, an independent worship tradition emerged, overshadowing her role as an attendant deity. The second case study is Sachika, who is mainly worshipped in Rajasthan, but also in some parts of Gujarat among Shvetambara Jains. She is the Kula Devi of Oswal Jains, and Kula Devis are associated with a particular caste or a lineage. But in the Oswal's origin city, which is Oshian in western Rajasthan, caste and lineage identities have merged. So we must note that we must also know that most Oswals, who are mainly but not exclusively Jain, indeed consider Sachika to be their Kula Devi, however, not all of them do. The narrative associated with Sachika sheds some more light on the situation in Ossian. So let us now have a look at the narratives associated with these two goddesses. My aim is to explore how the goddess's fierceness is aligned with the principle of ahiṃsa through these narratives. So Jwalamalini's independent status is confirmed by the composition of the Jwalamalini Kalpa, which is a 10th century Sanskrit text written by Digambara ascetic Indranandi. This kalpa is a manual of Jain Tantra practices, which reveals the tantric nature of Jwalamalini's tradition. Interestingly, the kalpa has an opening narrative in which the origin of Jwalamalini's worship tradition is narrated. Unfortunately, I do not have the time to cover the whole storyline, but in the second and the third verse of the kalpa, Jwalamalini's iconography is described. At first glance, her depiction seems to be identical to the Mahishasura-Mardini iconography. However, there is one important difference. Instead of slaying the buffalo demon, Jwalamalini tames it to become her mount, her vahana. In this way, the Jain goddess can be fierce and simultaneously embody the principle of ahiṃsa. The narrative associated with Sachika is the origin story of the Oswal Jains of Ossian. The story is found in the Upakesha Gacha Patavali, which is a 17th century Sanskrit text. It's a Jain monastic lineage text of the Upakesha Gacha, which is the lineage in which the Oswals were incorporated after embracing Jainism. The narrative also reveals the influence of Hindu goddess traditions on Sachika, more specifically the worship tradition of goddess Chamunda, known to be one of the most ferocious forms of the Mahishasura Mardini. The monastic lineage text of the Oswald Jains, Suryupakeshagachapatavali, tells the story of Sachika when discussing the sixth successor of this lineage, named Ratnaprabhasuri. This narrative is often described as a conversion story, where the warlike Rajputs are converted into non-violent Oswald Jains by the Acharya Ratnaprabhasuri. Interestingly, their conversion seems to be incomplete until their fierce sacrifice-demanding Kula Devi, which is Chamunda, also transforms into the non-violent vegetarian goddess who is now suitable for Jain worship and who is renamed as Sachika. The narrative clearly emphasizes the change of the goddess's nature with the focus on her diet, but her iconography remains unaltered. So the way Sachika is depicted is identical to the traditional Mahishasura Mardini iconography. So I quickly want to point out some religious interactions that have shaped these Jain goddess traditions. The iconography of Jwalamalini and Sachika is an illustration of the influence of Hindu goddess traditions. In the area of Sachika's worship, the Mahishasura Mardini was very popular, and her fierce manifestation, Chamunda, was an important deity in the area as a Kula Devi, confirming the warlike identity of the Rajput community. In Jwalamalini's case, the Shakta traditions were incorporated into Shaivism, which gained dominance during the medieval time in the region of present-day Karnataka. So interactions and competitions between the Jains and Shaivas were common, as they were both striving for royal patronage. Another important influence on Jwalamalini's worship was Tantra. Although Tantra never developed into a school of thought within Jainism, it offered new methods and practical knowledge on performing rituals for the Jains. The Jwalamalini Kalpa also illustrates the pragmatic focus of a Jain Tantra. It is important to note here that the interactions between Jains and Hindus have been misunderstood by early scholars. One of the results was that Jain goddess traditions were considered as marginal phenomena or mere appropriations from Hinduism. But in more recent times, this perspective has been reviewed and scholars have gained more nuanced insight. For example, Leslie Orr encourages scholars to keep in mind that Jain and Hindu goddess traditions draw on a shared framework, that is, a South Asian framework. Especially during the medieval times, the rigid division between Jain and Hindu traditions should be reconsidered according to Orr. So let me conclude with some final remarks. Jwalamalini and Sachika have little in common. Jwalamalini is a Yakshi worshipped by Digambara Jains situated in South India, whereas Sachika is a Kula Devi worshipped by Shwetambara Jains situated in Northwest India. However, they clearly share a fierce iconography that is consistent with the traditional depiction of the Hindu Mahishasura Mardini. So looking at the narratives associated with Jwalamalini and Sachika, their fierceness does not seem to contradict the principle of ahiṃsa. Despite their fierce depiction, they still represent the Jain values as exemplary figures for the Jain community. More specifically, ahiṃsa is clearly represented by the fierce goddesses. In Jwalamalini's case, her neutral attitude towards the weapons she's holding is emphasized, and in the case of Sachika, the focus is on her vegetarian diet. So I suggest that the narratives manage to redefine fierceness or overcoming it in an inner strength to enforce the Jain identity of these goddesses. Clearly, fierceness is not an obstacle in establishing the Jain identity of both Jwalamalini and Sachika. Okay, thank you very much. I will stop sharing. All right.
Thank you so much, Maja. That was brilliant. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Jyoti Agarwal, who is a PhD candidate at Emory University in Atlanta. So Jyoti completed her master degree at the Center for Historical Study in Jawaharlal Nehru University. And she received a bachelor degree in history from Delhi University in 2017, and a master degree before that in medieval history from GNU. Her research interests include early modern South Asian, regional histories, religious mobilities, and also Jain pilgrimages, Mughals, and connected history of South Asia. So we are delighted today to hear her speak about sacred journeys, Śikharjī, Jains, and Mughal in Jharkhand between 1600 and 1800. Thank you very much, Jyoti.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here and thank you for the opportunity. So today I'll be sharing a brief overview of my PhD research, which is at its very initial stages, and I have kept the title really broad, which is Sacred Journeys, Śikharjīs, Jains and Mughals in Jharkhand, 17th and 18th century, and I'm still developing a lot of things around it. So the title was intentional because I will be dealing with these two regions and Jains and Mughals within the context of early modern South Asia. So I will begin by giving you a context of Śikharjī, which is the central focus of this research. Śikharjī is also known as Parasnath Hill, and it is one of the most important Jain pilgrimage sites. It houses almost over 72 temples in the present day, and it is believed that 22 Jain Tirthankars attain moksha on this hill. Apart from Jains, the site is also religiously equally important for the Adivasis or the indigenous communities of Jharkhand, particularly Santals. They comprise 26% of the Jharkhand's population today. So this overlapping legal and religious claims over the hill has took a lot of political contestation over the last 100 years. And the legal conflict over the site goes back to as early as 1861. And these sites have involved multiple stakeholders, and these stakeholders includes various Jain sects, colonial government, present day state government of Jharkhand, the central government of India. It also involves indigenous communities of Jharkhand, individual merchant communities, and religious trusts. So there are multiple stakeholders in this dispute, and the dispute is ongoing. The most latest development was early this month when High Court of Jharkhand banned liquor consumption, non-vegetarian food, and certain kinds of tourism activities around Parasnath Hill up to the radius of 25 kilometers. So these conflicts around Parasnath Hill is not just a conflict of religious contestation. It is a bigger political movement, and it has a lot of questions about the region, about regional identity, and the whole framing of the idea of Jharkhand itself. So here I will also quickly give you an overview of Jharkhand as a state. So Jharkhand as a state was formed in the year 2000 after a century-long movement of regional autonomy. And this movement of separation of Jharkhand from two big states of Bihar and Bengal was not just like a division of territory. Rather, it was a movement of assertion of indigenous rights of the region and a claim over land and ancestral social-religious activities. So within these contexts, I started this project with uh, from a historical lens and understanding that how long the claim of Śikharjī and these contestations trace back to. And one of the central questions from which my research is centered on is that what did Śikharjī look like in early modern period before colonial laws redefined land, religion, community in more legal terms? And what was the nature of this conflict? And four central research question which I have been currently working around are: how was ritual authority exercised and legitimized in sacred spaces like Śikharjī before the arrival of colonial legal frameworks, which started defining religious sites in terms of land ownership? The second question is: in what ways Jains, Mughals, indigenous communities, and the local political actors interact through pilgrimages, trade, and shared ritual practices? What kind of claims over sacred spaces do we find in pre-colonial sources such as Jain texts, Mughal farmans, pilgrimage narratives, which are revoked again and again in multiple court cases, which is still ongoing? And lastly, how did early modern pilgrimage network help shape regional identities and sacred geographies in Eastern India? So, just giving again like a historical context, in early modern period, Jharkhand was not a peripheral region as it is described by most colonial sources and even post-colonial scholarship. Mughal sources have extensively used the word Jharkhand, and the word is used to describe the forested region across transitional zones between Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. And it was situated on a crucial land and maritime routes connecting Ganga Plains and the Bay of Bengal, which facilitated overland routes not only for Mughal army but for pilgrims and traders, and contributed to the expansion of long distance trade and shaping of global maritime network in the 17th and 18th century. Jain communities here, especially merchant communities and ascetics, moved eastward along with the expansion of Mughal authority in this region. Śikharjī became a vibrant center of pilgrimage and commerce. Jain elites built temples, they funded religious centers, rest houses, sponsored religious texts that embedded their sacred geography into the broader religious and regional map of Eastern India. And the story was not one sided. Local rulers and indigenous communities were active participants, sometimes accommodating, sometimes contesting these developments. In this story, Śikharjī was never a fixed religious site. It was and it remains a negotiated space, a landscape where multiple communities have laid their spiritual and political claim going as early as 17th century. So to go on with this project and to look at these questions, I am working through an interdisciplinary methodology where I employ a lot of theoretical framework from religious studies, from history, and from legal anthropology. My sources include Mughal Farmans and Mughal Chronicles, State Chronicles. I work with Jain pilgrimage accounts, which are in Braj, Hindi, and Sanskrit. These are travel narratives. Most of these travelogues, accounts of these grand pilgrimages, which took place from North in Indian states from Delhi and Agra to Parasnath in early 17th and late 18th centuries. And I also look at legal court cases ranging as early as 19th centuries, which discusses these historical sources and how these historical sources are then reinterpreted in these contemporary court cases. My work is in conversation with various existing scholarship. I engage with historiographies, and I work with and I build on work of scholars like Shamira Sheikh, Divya Cherian, and Kumkum Chatterjee, who have shown this how merchant religious and political ties have shaped regional religious cultures in Gujarat, Rajasthan, and Bengal. And I extend the similar framework in my study of Jharkhand in early modern historiography. And I also draw extensively on Jain studies scholars, particularly Peter Flugel, John Cort, Audrey Tushke, Shaleen Jains, who have emphasized on the role of Jain ascetics and merchants in constructing of religious authority. And I also engage particularly with the recent work of Stephen Bose, where he has pointed out to the omission of Parasnath in Vividatirtha Kalpa, and how he has talked about the making of sacred spaces shaped by these historical and socio-political factors. Just to conclude, the main argument which I want to present through my work as of now is that I want to place Parasnath Hill as a dynamic site where Mughal state, Jain ascetics, merchants, local rulers, and indigenous communities interacted, negotiated, and redefined their relationship continuously spiritually, politically, and economically. And by doing this, I want to challenge the fixed notion of religious identities in pre-colonial South Asia. And I want to utilize the understanding of sacred spaces as zones of negotiations and interactions, exchanges, and mobility. And the larger purpose of this project is also to situate Jharkhand within early modern South Asian historiographies and regional studies. Thank you.
And so now I think that it is my pleasure to introduce Achyut Jain, who Achyut Jain is an assistant professor at the Center for Jain Studies at the Jain University in Bangalore. He earned his PhD from the Jain Bharati Institute in London, and his research focused on the application of causality in Jain philosophy. He has earned his master from Sri Lal Bahadur Shastri National Sanskrit University in Delhi, and an MA in Jainology and Comparative Religion and Philosophy from JVBI, and a Shastri degree from Jagadguru Ranandracharya Rajasthan Sanskrit University. And so, following the topics on Gunasthana that was referred to just earlier, Achyut will talk to us about the dynamics of Dravyalinga and Bhavalinga in Jain soteriology, a Gunasthana perspective. Achyut, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Mary Helen, for your kind introduction. I hope my screen is visible.
It is, but it's not full screen yet.
Okay.
I don't know
Yes.
if you want.
Okay.
Yes, perfect.
So today I'm going to present on the dynamics of Draviling and Bhavling in Jain soteriology, a Gurnistan perspective. The concept of ling holds a central place in Jain soteriology, especially in relation to the path of liberation, as seen in texts like Tatvar Sutra, both in Shwetambar tradition 10.7 and Digambar 10.9 Sutra. In these sutras, ling is also understood in two ways: as a gender, feminine, masculine, and neutral, and as a type of ascetic identity, jinling or nirgrinthling, grahasthaling, and annaling. On both fronts, Digambar and Shwetambar views diverge. In the present context, ling refers to identifying marks. Draviling denotes the external sign of monkhood, while Bhavling refers to the internal spiritual state that defines true asceticism. Here, ling means characteristic sign or identifier of authentic renunciation. The distinction between both links appear prominently in Shramanacharya literature, particularly in the works of Acharya Kunda, such as Moksha Pahud, Linga Pahud, Samaysar, and Pravchansar. Most notably in Bhav Pahud, where he devotes 165 verses to this theme, consistently emphasizing the superiority of Bhavling over Draviling. For instance, in the verse 2, he declares Bhavling is the primary sign, Draviling is not the ultimate reality. Whereas in verse in 100, he contrasts the auspicious result of Bhavling with the suffering that follows Draviling without inner purity. This emphasis is echoed in other texts like Mula Radhana verses 1002, which states that only Bhavling ascetics are true Shramans. The distinctions extend beyond every early Prakrit literature into devotional compositions. For example, the Shwetambar mendicant Anand Ghan writes, one who knows the self is a Shraman, others are merely Dravilingis. Similarly, in the Samyaktuki Sajjhai, Deven Chandra Maharaj reflects on repeatedly adopting Draviling without achieving liberation. So there is a frequent discussion of both Draviling and Bhavling. On one hand, texts offer guidance and encouragement for adopting Draviling. On the other, for those who already possess it, the importance of developing Bhavling is stressed. Repeatedly, it is affirmed that Draviling alone does not lead to liberation. Those relying solely on it are said to be reborn maximum in the Graivik heaven. So these paired concepts appear under various names. For example, Dravya Shraman and Bhav Shraman, Dravya Charitra and Bhav Charitra, Bahirang Ling and Antarang Ling, Dravya Sadhu versus Bhav Sadhu, across both Digambar and Shwetambar traditions. In this presentation, I will explore the dynamics of Draviling and Bhavling and examine their relation to the Gunistan framework, the 14 stages of spiritual development in Jain philosophy. Draviling in the Digambar traditions. So according to the Mulachar verses 908, Draviling, the external sign of true monkhood, comprises four essential elements. There are complete nudity, hair plucking, the neglect of bodily care, and carrying a peacock feather whisk. Whereas in Pravchansar verses 205 further characterizes the authentic Draviling as maintaining the natural state of the body as at birth, being free of head and facial hair, possessing nothing, abstraining from violence, and avoiding bodily adornments. Together, these features form the external hallmarks of the Digambar asceticism. Reveling in the Shwetambar tradition. In the Shwetambar tradition, the 41 Sutra of Nandi Sutra describes the 15 types of Siddhas, while the Shwetambar edition of Tattvard Sutra 10.7 refers the 12. Among these, liberation is considered possible for individuals bearing three types of lingas: Swalinga, Anyalinga, and Grahasthalinga. In this framework, the key external identifiers of Swalingi sadhu are the Rajoharan and the Mukhvastrika, and Rajoharan and Mukhvastrika as a key sign of a Dravilingi sadhu can also be seen in the Panchashak Prakarana of Haribhadra Suri. So in Shwetambar tradition, external identifiers such as Rajoharan and Mukhvastrika serve as a visible sign of ascetic identity. In contrast, the Digambar tradition emphasizes the Achelakatva, the complete nudity, and peacock feather wigs as the defining markers of Dravilinga. These contrasting symbols reflect fundamentally different conceptions of external renunciation in two sects. This divergence in the notion of Draviling is not merely ritualistic, but represent deeper doctrinal differences. It is vividly reflected in the very names of the tradition itself. For example, Digambar, sky-clad, and Shwetambar, white-clad, each encapsulating their respective emphasis on the external expression of ascetic identity. The nature of Bhavling. In Bhav Pahod, Acharya Kundu Kundu uses the term Bhav across multiple contexts, from the 12 contemplations, Anuprekshas, and 16 pure dispositions that generate Tirthankar Nam, Karma, Sola Karan Bhavana, to the internal attitudes behind the 5 great vows, Panch Mahavrit Bhavana, mental states, and proper spiritual dispositions. Among Kundu Kundu, many references to the Bhavling, one defining trait stands out: the embodiment of three jewels, Ratnatraya: right faith, right knowledge, and right conduct. This core is articulated in verses 128 of Bhav Pahod, where he says, "Blessed are those monks unceasingly established in right vision, knowledge, and conduct, united with pure intention and free from deluded karma. To them I bow with mind, speech, and body." All other traits listed in the text, such as Bhav Pahud verses 56 and Pravachan Sar verses 206, are either elaborations of or grounded in the central definition. Thus, Bhavling represent the inner spiritual realization that defines a true sadhu, not through mere external discipline, but through internal attainment of three jewels. This interpretation is supported by the text that critique Dravviling when devoid of inner transformation. For instance, Samaisar verses 410 states that the external signs of ascetics or householders are not the path to liberation. The Jinas declare right faith, knowledge, and conduct as the true path. Similarly, in Bhagavati Aradhana verses 770 asserts that monastic life without right faith cannot lead to liberation. While Moksha Pahud verses 57 states, "What joy is there in adopting a monastic form where knowledge lacks conduct, austerity lacks right faith, and other practices lack pure intention." Importantly, these criticisms are directed not at Draviling itself, but at those who believe external appearance alone ensure liberation. The critique targets Dravilinga devoid of Bhavalinga. When the two are united, neither tradition, Digambar nor Shwetambar, offers any criticism. Ultimately, Bhavling signifies the genuine internalization of three jewels along with the destruction of passions like pride, deceit, and attachment. It represents the true inner state necessary for liberation beyond external symbols and formal austerities. Aligning Draviling, Bhavling with the Gunistan concept and framework. When we attempt to integrate the concept of Bhavling with the Gunistan framework, an apparent contradiction emerges. If Bhavling is defined as the possession of right faith, knowledge, and conduct, and the absence of deluding passion, then this would apply to all spiritual stages from fourth Gunistan onwards. So this broad application would seemingly eliminate any meaningful distinctions between Bhav Sadhu, a true monk, and a Bhav Shravak, a true householder. So this conceptual challenge can be resolved by recognizing that Bhavling represent a common characteristic applicable to both householders and monks from the fourth Gunistan upward, as Kundu Kundu suggests in verse 66 of Bhav Pahur. This verse indicates that without proper spiritual disposition, Bhav, neither the monastic path nor the householder path bear fruit. Bhav serve as the fundamental cause of authentic spiritual practice in both contexts. Although right faith and knowledge remain consistent across the spiritual stage from fourth Gurdistan onward, right conduct varies significantly between stages. For example, fourth Gurdistan conduct characterized by the absence of Anantanubandhi passion. Fifth Gunistan conduct characterized by the absence of apratyakhyan passion. Sixth and seventh Gunistan conduct characterized by the absence of pratyakhyan passions along with Anantanubandhi and pratyakhyan, with only Sanjalan and no Kashaya passions remaining. So these claims is also supported by the Government Sar Jeev Khan verses 32 and 45. So let's move on to the key insights from the Haribhadra Suri's Panchashak Prakran. So Haribhadra Suri's Panchashak Prakran further clarifies this relationship between Sanjalan passion and monastic status. In his verses of 17th chapter from 48 to 51, explains that transgressions caused by Sanjalan passion do not destroy monkhood, whereas the presence of Anantanubandhi and other severe passions does negate the authentic monastic status. Thus, a Bhavlingi sadhu must exist at 6th or 7th Gunistan, characterized by the absence of three categories of passions, Arantanubandhi, Apratyakhyanavar, and Pratyakhyanavar, with only Sanjalan and no Kashaya passions remaining active. This discussion is also means that an individual may externally adopt Raviling, while internally occupying any Gunistan from the 1st through the 7th, but authentic Bhavling for monks specifically requires a 6th or 7th stage. In conclusion, while the concept of Draviling differs between the Shwetambar and Digambar traditions, the understanding of Bhavaling remains consistent across both. From the perspective of Charananyog or Charan Karnanyog, Bhavaling is defined as the presence of Samyak Darshan, Samyak Gyan, and Samyak Charit. In contrast, within the Ganitani Yog or Karnanyog framework, Bhavaling is marked by the absence of three intense passions, the presence of only Sanjulan and Naukashai. Further exploration is needed to understand the relationship between Draviling and Bhavling. Does Draviling give rise to Bhavling, or is it other way around? Which arises first in the process of spiritual development? Additionally, how does this dynamic align with or differ from the concept of anniling and grahasthaling in the Shwetambar tradition? Thank you so much for giving your attention.
Thank you, Achyut, very much. And just in the interest of time, I'll go right into introducing our next speaker before we go into the various dialogues we will have. So our next speaker is Ashi Jain, who's a PhD candidate from the University of Ottawa, Canada. Her research is focusing on the intersection of religion, ethics, and end-of-life decision-making. Her research examines the Jain ritual practice of salekana, a voluntary fasting to death, analyzing its implications for contemporary bioethical discussions on autonomy, dignity, and palliative care. Jain earned her Master's of Arts from Florida International University, where she investigated the medicalization of Jain faith-based healing practices through the Bhaktamar Stotra. Since 2022, she has been an active volunteer with Dying with Dignity Canada, engaging with ethical issues surrounding end-of-life care. Ashi, we welcome you to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Miller, for the introduction, and thank you for having me. I will start. In earlier times, the sacred was associated with something transcendent and immutable. In modern secular society, we find that it is attached to ethical principles justified through rational arguments about human dignity and the autonomy of individuals. In my research, I argue that the conventional religion versus secular binary obscures the sacred dimension of secular values, particularly in end-of-life decisions. My research posits that the sacred hasn't disappeared. Rather, it manifests in new forms within secular context. By examining Salekna and Maid practices at opposite ends of the religion-secular spectrum, I aim to reveal the underlying orientation to the sacred that informs these choices, challenging the simplistic dichotomy between religious and secular motivations. Ultimately, my research illuminates diverse engagements with ultimate concerns like meaning and a good death across both religious and secular contexts. For this presentation, I will only be focusing on the ethical aspect of my research using insights from my interviews. In my research, I ask these central questions: how individuals conceptualize their end-of-life decisions in terms of deeply held values. Secondly, in what ways secular end-of-life choices, such as Maid, reflect understandings of the sacred, even if not explicitly framed in religious context. Third, how cultural, religious, and philosophical backgrounds influence the perception of sacredness in end-of-life decisions. Just a bit of background for those who are not aware. Salekna is the Jain ritual fast to death, is deeply rooted in the core Jain tenets of ahiṃsa, that is non-violence, and aparigraha, non-attachment. This practice, undertaken by Jains facing irreversible bodily decline, is historically memorialized in places like Shravanbelgola and exemplified by figures like Chandragupta Maurya. Key Jain texts such as Bhagavati Aradhana, are noted as important treatises on this subject. Salekna is often described as a means of thinning or weakening one's passion and purging the soul of karmas. A key element of Salekna is the gradual reduction of food and liquid intake. Death in the Jain tradition, as viewed by many of my interviewees, is viewed as a natural event and an opportunity for spiritual advancements. As such, Salekna is not about fearing death, but embracing it as a means to liberation. In my interviews, many participants use the terms interchangeably, Salekna and Santhara, while a small fraction of them reflected on and pointed out the difference. As they mentioned, Santhara primarily refers to the vow itself of renunciation, such as giving up of food. Salekna, on the other hand, encompasses the broader process that includes reflection on past actions and seeking forgiveness from all beings for any harms caused. Thus, the vow of Santhara is undertaken and the process of Salekna is performed. The ultimate goal of Santhara is Samadhi Maran. A little bit about MAID, just the background. Medical assistance in dying was legalized in Canada in 2016 under stringent criteria. Adults with a grievous and irremediable medical condition, irreversible decline, and intolerable physical or psychological suffering may request physician-assisted death. By 2023, over 44,958 individuals had chosen MAID, accounting for 4.1% of all Canadian deaths in 2022. I will just quickly give an overview about the process. MAID, codified in Bill C7, operationalizes autonomy through stringent legal medical protocols. Eligibility hinges on a multi-stage assessment. First is voluntary request. A written request has to be submitted that is free from coercion and it initiates the process. Then is the dual practitioner review. 2 independent clinicians are required. As one of my respondents mentioned, that they are required to make sure that the person or the patient is of sound mind and sound body and has understood the process. And the final confirmation is also required on the day of the procedure. Then there are some safeguards that includes a 90-day reflection period and the final consent that is immediate reconfirmation before MAID administration ensures ongoing voluntariness. For my theoretical framework, along with qualitative research through interviews, I will employ a multifaceted theoretical framework to analyze the contrasting end-of-life practices of MAID and Salekna. Drawing on Durkheim's sociology, I will investigate how both Salekna and MAID generate their own forms of social connection and moral frameworks. Taylor's framework will help to examine how the immanent frame shapes perceptions of self, suffering, and the good life, thus legitimizing MAID as a compassionate response to pain. Salekna conversely operates within a different moral and metaphysical context, emphasizing self-transcendence and spiritual liberation. Then I'll use Eliade's work that will inform an analysis of how Salekna transforms dying into a sacred event filled with symbolic and spiritual. The methodical detachment from the world, the ritual fast, and the seeking of forgiveness contribute to sacralization, which differs greatly from MAID's often secular and medicalized environment. I'll also employ Laidlaw's analysis of Salekna to deconstruct agency beyond individual autonomy, revealing its embeddedness in Jain ethics, along with the work of Professor Donaldson and Sean Hillman. I will reflect on this process of Salekna through the case study of Dada, whose picture you see on the left side of the screen, the grandfather of one of my research participants. For preparation and intention, Dada had spent approximately 20 years gradually reducing his diet, observing regular fast, and abstaining from certain foods like onion, garlic, green vegetable. On January 4th of this year, he began his final fast, Santhara. The decision was rooted in a spiritual foundation undertaken as a death was perceived as imminent due to the advanced age. His process involved seeking forgiveness, as demonstrated by Dada greeting visitors with folded hands and a smile, apologizing to those he felt he may have wronged. The fast itself, in the weeks leading up to his Santhara, he further restricted his diet, eliminated ghee, grains, and milk. For 3 days, he consumed only chachkiyas, followed by warm water for 3 days. Once the Santhara officially started, it was a Tivyar Santhara, where water was initially permitted but later stopped. However, Dada chose to stop drinking water around January 10th, continuing his fast without water for 18 days. This gradual withdrawal was a physical expression of detaching from worldly attachments, with Dada focusing on inner reflection. Dada Salekna was understood as an act of non-violence aimed at minimizing harm and reducing karmic accumulation. Central to his practice was the idea of vairagya or detachment, in which he gave up his degree of chartered accountancy and also requested Maharaj Sahib to initiate him. Dada's case highlights several key aspects of Salekna. It mentions that Salekna is not an isolated act, but rather the culmination of a lifelong commitment to Jain principles. It also underscores the importance of intention, emphasizing detachment and minimizing harm rather than escaping suffering. The interviews with male advocates, they reveal diverse perspectives. Some of the common themes revolve around the concept of autonomy and choice. Autonomy and choice, they are paramount values, with many participants strongly advocating dying with dignity and providing choice. They link the ability to make end-of-life decisions with wanting dignity and autonomy as you are living. Another theme that emerges is the concept of humanism. Many advocates of MAID explicitly identified themselves as a humanist, focusing on the understanding that this life is the one chance you have. The core tenet for them is believing in humanity and focusing on helping fellow human beings and others, emphasizing leaving the world, and I quote, a little bit better than before. Many of my respondents earlier were Catholics and moved to being spiritual and humanist when the church didn't provide them the right to die on their own terms. Third one is spirituality and the human soul. Some of my interviewees expressed the belief that society may have lost the touch with human soul, and perhaps that connection represents sacredness. In this sense, allowing the spirit's journey to conclude when it's ready, even though a choice like made could potentially align with the spiritual understanding of purpose or the completion of our journey. For some, end-of-life decision involve looking at total person at each moment. MAID operates within a secular framework that prioritizes individual autonomy and the right to self-determination. This emphasis was clearly reflected in the comments made by my participants, where Short stated that, I quote, "We believe in body autonomy." And Mary's sentiment, I quote, "My body, my choice, my life, my death, my choice," encapsulate this perspective. In conclusion, sorry. Yeah. Ultimately, both, although it's a work in progress, but I believe ultimately both Salekna and MAID offer distinct responses to the challenges of mortality shaped by their unique value system. Salekna embodies a path of spiritual transcendence achieved through self-discipline and communal ritual, prioritizing karmic purification and detachment from worldly attachments, whereas in contrast, MAID reflects a secular emphasis on individual autonomy and legal safeguards, seeking to alleviate suffering and ensure a dignified exit on one's own terms. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashi. And I believe now over to you, John.
Okay, thank you all. Is my sound okay? Okay. Never know with technology here, especially since we have people all the way from South India to Southern California involved in this. How'd you miss somebody from Australia and Hawaii, Chris? You missed some places.
Next time.
Next time. Okay, I'm just going to make a couple comments as I was jotting down notes. In some cases, I had comments, and some cases I had questions, and just sort of raise a couple things. And I want to turn very quickly to the broader Q&A of the audience. And I'll just say to all 5 of the speakers, I'm more than happy to get into email conversations with you afterwards, and some of you I already am. And I'll start in the order in which they were done, and I'm actually going to combine Maja and Jyoti's papers in some ways, because I saw all sorts of overlaps between them, especially in ways in which something that emerged in other papers too. Certainly Ashi's very much, where looking at Jain materials in isolation clearly just doesn't work, is insufficient, that you're looking at traditions, cultures, practices that are deeply embedded in society as a whole, in culture as a whole, and it's almost more like a Jain flavor on a common practice. And I think Maja highlights to us the multiple roles of a goddess, and here I think back to his name went right out of my head, but William Payton, who years ago wrote a textbook on religion called Religious Worlds, and he said God, using that not as a theological term, but as a comparative religious term, actually denotes a relationship. It is not a being, but a relationship. And so we can look at the relationships of humans with these goddesses and realize how different they can be. She is a Jain protector deity, something you didn't mention, but Satya is also the Adhishtayak Devi of the Upkesh Gutch, so she has a role for both the caste and the Gutch. She's a Kul Devi, so suddenly it's not a Jain as a Jain, but a Jain as an Oswal. And of course, she's Kul Devi of many non-Jain castes as well. She's also oftentimes a deity of a place. I mean, if you really want to worship her, you go to Osean. There are other temples, but she's mostly there. But in neither, not in her case, is she ever a supreme deity. She's not tied to soteriology. That is not a relationship one has with Satya. And I think that's sort of important to think about things that are not there in our data, as well as things that are there in our data. And certainly as you move forward in this, I mean, I'm curious to see, I know a lot more about Satya than Jvalamalini, but to what extent Jvalamalini might also have a caste identity in Karnataka, I don't know. But I think that's a question worth asking. But certainly the way in which she's at the center of multiple religious, sectarian, caste identities fits in very well with Jyoti's discussion of Summit Shikhar, which is also a place where we have these contested identifications of what is this place, and ties into a long, long history of contestations between Jains and non-Jains over geographical spots, in addition to Shvetambar Digambar contestations. But it's interesting then to put those contestations within an historical perspective, as Jyoti is doing here in the early modern period of, the Mughals, and as she points out, lots and lots of Jains from North India and Rajasthan, I mean, all the Marwaris and all that, following the Mughals to Eastern India, and then reclaiming Summit Shikhar as a Jain spot. And of course, they had official connections, legal connections, economic power. I mean, they could bring a lot to these contestations that they oftentimes won. But that doesn't mean that the other identities disappear. And I think here about some comparative things of looking, for example, at Kesariyaji in southern Rajasthan, which Carolyn Humphrey wrote about also, or the Digambar site of Mahavirji in northern Rajasthan, which is also worshipped by many Adivasis. Sometimes the same image, sometimes it's a different deity. But also then how Jain sites oftentimes will have non-liberated deities, that weird term I invented in the encyclopedia. This ties into Maya's again, who've got a different clientele. So again, the Mahavirji temple in Osean is visited quite regularly by Dalits at the time of marriage who worship the Beru who's there. and it's outside the temple, but it's still part of the complex, and how these sites are sometimes contested, sometimes shared in a variety of ways. And the last thing that Jyoti mentioned that I'll just sort of touch on, because it also gets into Ashi's paper, I think increasingly scholars of the Jains are realizing that as you look at especially the modern period, the last couple centuries, the dominant power discourse, knowledge discourse globally in the 20th and 21st century is the legal system. And so looking at ways, and Manisha Sethi has done spectacular work on this, ways in which Jain traditions, practices, customs, society interacts with legal systems is increasingly important for us. As I would always tell my students, I might be a professor of religion, but I don't define religion in America. That is done by zoning boards and tax courts. Those are the people who define what is religion. And, so you're running into those sorts of things in India also, and in Canada. Okay, to turn to Alba's paper, and I will echo Marie-Hélène, and it's wonderful to have people looking at Yeshu Vijay. We need a dozen or so more. I mean, he's such a complex figure. I don't think a human can read all the things he wrote. It's just he wrote so much material. But a couple questions I have for you on that. And again, this is reflecting that we still need a lot more work to be done on Yeshu Vijay. But, if we think about some of the a key moment in his life was the time he spent in Benares and was studying, Navya Nyaya, and sort of bringing Jainism into the latest intellectual fashion, and to what extent, I think then we have to ask, are texts written before his Benares time and after his Benares? I just don't know. But also, even after that, to what extent can we put his text in some kind of chronological order to start developing a bit of a history of the development of Yeshu Vijay's thoughts? This is far more than you can do in your dissertation, but I think it's a kind of perspective we need to be bringing to someone as complex as him, or Haribhadra. Anil's here too. But the question of when and where did he write the particular text you're looking at, and how where it fits into his larger biography. But also, the way you point out that his text is a wonderful, what did you say, adaptive reuse of both quotation and original things, totally intermixed, in a way that we would, wrap our students' knuckles and send them to the honors board for plagiarism. That wasn't a problem for Yeshu Vijay. He's incorporating other people's texts in as his own. But the question, the commentaries then oftentimes indicate what those sources were. So, but there's still ways in which it raises the question of audience for him in this text. What did he, and again, I don't expect you to answer this right away, but what else did he expect his audience to have read to have made sense of his text and his arguments? I think it is something that's very important. I said enough Sanskrit words that AI said, "Are you speaking English or not?" Welcome to computers. So, what did he expect his audience to know? And that also raises a question, which I've addressed in a little bit on Yeshu Vijay and some others, is what was his potential audience for this text? Was it just Jains? Was it Shvetambar Jains? Was he also addressing Digambar? Was he addressing, other sectarian groups within the Jain tradition? Was he addressing Brahmins who wrote on yoga philosophy? I mean, just sort of, if you can give us a sense, maybe not now, of whom he was addressing in this. Who is his audience? I think that's always an important question to ask in philosophical texts. Okay, I don't want to spend forever. I said I want to leave time for questions. So Achyut's wonderful paper on soteriology, taking us in some different directions than those other papers. And here, I want to make there's somewhere between a question and a suggestion. I'm not, it's, if you can answer the question, then it's something I want to hear. Otherwise, it's more of a suggestion. But I'm thinking about comments both by Kendall Folkert and Paul Dundas about the need to historicize Jain thought. That Jain presentations of this, and yours was very much doing this, sort of tend to be ahistorical and presented as just a timeless batch of ideas. I'm exaggerating here a little bit, Jyoti, but sort of bear with me on this. But so my question would be, what would, and you were citing on the Digambar Things texts over a 1,000-year period, and then you brought in a couple early modern Shvetambar texts, so suddenly we were getting like a 1,600-year time span. And you were looking at sectarian differences. I would like to also see what it's like if we try and do a history of, say, Digambar understandings of Dravyalinga. That if you look at some of these, you were quoting some very early texts, and then within the Kunda corpus, you did some early texts like the Samayasar, and then you did the Pahudas several centuries later, and then you ended up with the Gomatasara, and that's a long duration. And I'm curious, is there actually a history to understandings of Dravyalinga that is worth pursuing? And I think that's something we need to do as historians of philosophy, of historians of thought, historians of knowledge. So that's some suggestions there. And finally, Ashi's paper and I thought, again, the way in which you very much bring your informants and the practices into a contemporary Canadian legal context is really important there. A couple of questions I just had or suggestions. One is, you mentioned early on, and I think this opens up that there's a lot of interesting scholarship, I think, here of the work of T.N. Mudden and others on what is a good death. It's not something we necessarily address in religious studies, but there's always a notion of, that was a good death, that was a bad death, it was unfortunate, it was timely, it was untimely, and the ways in which that can be controlled or not controlled. I think there's some interesting comparative stuff to look at there. But it occurred to me, and this is something probably applies to the others who are also looking into Salekana and Santar these days, is there's a focus on the regional and sectarian traditions where it is not widespread, but it is there as a practice. But maybe I'm going on a limb here, but I would speculate that the majority of Jains in India do not practice this. In all my field work in Gujarat, I never heard the terms mentioned amongst Shvetambar Murti Pujiks in Gujarat, Tapakach. It just wasn't there. And, the death of a mendicant would be Samadhi Marana or Devlok Gaman, Kaldarm, just as a general term for death. But the notion of a controlled practice, vowed death just wasn't there in those communities. And I think it would be interesting to also be interviewing Jains in India and the diaspora for whom Salekana is not an important practice. I think that will help you get a bit of a better sense of what's going on. And here again, sort of similar to my request for Achyut, I think we really need to better historicize this. It's quite clear that in the past 50 years, it's gotten a lot more visibility, which is why there are the Supreme Court challenges and things like that. The numbers have increased. There are factors we can investigate in that. But sort of why, as a response to modernity, do we say have some communities of Jains more actively appropriating a practice that was very rare in the past? Again, sort of speaking as a historian, asking you to look at some of those things. So those are, questions, comments on 5 wonderful sets of 5 wonderful papers. And I see we now have a whole bunch of questions. which it's my duty to take a look at. And so give me a second here. I was looking at some of these. And actually, the first two questions, which I will then read, and these are for Maja. You went first, so you get the first question. That's only fair. One question from Samyak Jain. Does the combination of fierceness and kindness have implications for how Jains themselves should act? In other words, are they a moral aspiration or simply elements of mythological interests or others? In other words, is it a model for behavior? And that feeds directly into Anne Vallely's question. Your presentation made me think of Paul Dundas's discussion in the Jains, where he describes Jain ascetics as exemplars of the Virya Marg, a heroic path marked by martial codes of bravery, rigorous self-control, the ascetic pursuit of spiritual mastery. In light of this, do you think fierce Jain goddesses can similarly be seen as embodying a comparable ideal of spiritual heroism, one that fuses fearlessness, discipline, and transformative power? So in what ways do they form ideals of either individual conduct or spiritual paths, spiritual ideals? And so, Maja,
Okay.
what do you have?
Thank you for these questions. So I think it's important to keep in mind that Jain goddesses have some type of exemplary figure role, but especially they seem to have close relationships with the Jain lay community. So if we look at Sachika, for example, the story that I've discussed is really emphasizing giving up eating meat, for example, and giving up sacrificing animals. So the same is expected of her devotees, to not eat meat and to not sacrifice animals for any deity. In the case of Jwala Malini, I think it's not as explicit as in the story of Sachika, but since she's a Yakshi, which are mostly the attendant deities of the Tirthankaras in southern India, and in that role, they represent the teachings of the Tirthankaras. So they're not like entitled to provide teachings on how to attain liberation, but they do represent the teachings of the Tirthankaras, who obviously guide the Jains towards liberation. So in that sense, I would say that goddesses have some exemplary role. And to answer to the question about the heroicism, I think heroicism definitely is presented in the story of the Mahishasura Mardini, so the Hindu goddess, as she slays the demon who is like representing the evil. And this iconography is adopted when we look at Sachika or Jwalamalini. But according to the stories, they do not engage in a fight against evil necessarily. So I'm not sure if heroism is a term I would use to describe the goddesses in this context, but it's definitely an interesting question to explore further, I think.
Yeah. I'll just sort of follow up a little bit on that certainly their role as protector goddesses, protecting castes, protecting families, protecting lineages, I think does involve a kind of heroism. So maybe think about that a little bit. I would also caution with the goddesses against positing any kind of strong lay versus mendicant division. Most of the texts written to the goddesses are written by mendicant authors. This is true today. Most of the manuals and books and studies are written by mendicant authors. Many of, here is thinking, well, both the Digambar Beastpunti mendicants and in Shvetambar Murti Pujik, many of the mendicants are active promoters of the worship of goddesses in the same way they promote Nakora Bhairav and Guntakarn Mahavir. Some monks I met, their lay devotees described them as buas or sort of mediums for the goddess. They were possessed by the goddess. And you actually go back in lots of medieval stories about the roles of, Saraswati inspiring Hemachandra even, and others. So the role of goddesses in the lineages and the mendicant life and mendicant practice is something you really need to keep central there. So, but lots of things to look at with those two. Okay, and I'm sort of this is sort of a rather direct question for Ashi, going to the other end of the presentations from Lalit Aditya. Why did you choose Salekana and MAID? Aren't they both totally different and serve different purposes? And I know you addressed that some, but maybe sort of going back a little bit more at that might be helpful.
Sure. Thank you, Lalit, for asking that question. I think despite Salekana being a non-violent practice, it still exists in a gray area. Like the court has lifted the ban, but it has stayed the order. So it's not really legal to practice Salekana. On the other hand, MAID is legal in Canada since 2016. Both the practices, they involve voluntary death, but I believe their treatment reveals that how secular states, they privilege certain values, or as Dr. Cort was earlier mentioning about to explore like good death. So whose good death? I think I'm interested in exploring that whose good death does the law recognize and whose does it render invisible, if that makes sense. So I'm interested in investigating that how different traditions, they conceptualize suffering and autonomy and the idea of dignity and different ethical dimensions of death. And I believe that Salekana and MAID, they provide, like, although they are being on two different ends, but they provide that kind of spectrum.
And let me again jump in a little bit on that. And part of what's interesting, both in study of Salekana, but also I'm thinking about Andrea Leutley Hardenberg's work on Bal Diksha, and which is sort of the other end of life in many ways, which also has run into lots of legal challenges in India. And the law is based upon a certain kind of materialistic metaphysic of the definition of a person. A person is born at a certain time, and of course, in the United States, that's under debate, but still, there's a point at which a being comes into existence, and death is when that being leaves existence. And so it's a finite what is a person, which of course, Jain notions of rebirth say nonsense, that this is just one chapter. And so in the different conceptions of, initiation and controlled death, when you get the secular and the Jain perspectives side by side, they are radically different metaphysics that have to exist together somehow. So, I mean, I'm defending that this is asking some really interesting questions. And it's precisely, I think, the fact that it's not easily resolvable is part of the fruitfulness of it, and it allows you to look at it. So, I mean, actually, the question was, aren't these things totally different? Yes, precisely. That's why you've got a dissertation. If they were exactly the same, then who cares? We have, okay, I'm sort of waiting for more people to bring in questions. So, Jyoti, this is a long question from Anne Vallely, having a lot of stuff from north of the border. That's good. I'll just read it. I have a general question brings Jain material into a comparative framework. Many mystical traditions describe a path or stages of spiritual development. Of course, that's the Gunasthana model. And she mentioned St. Teresa's interior castle or Maqamat in Sufism, where mastery of external forms and disciplines is regarded as a necessary foundation for deeper inner realization. While this isn't perfectly analogous, I'm wondering whether a similar logic might apply in Jainism. Abhava linga is understood as dependent on a prior mastery of external ascetic disciplines as expressed through Dravya linga. In other words, is inner realization in some sense conditioned by sustained engagement with outward ascetic practice? And this may actually, in your, Achyut, you're thinking about this, it seems to me that this is a question right at the heart of Kunda Kunda's two truths notion and the critiques that one finds of that, especially amongst Yeshuvajay, amongst others. So, Achyut. Or did we lose Achyut?
I think the answer will be different.
Oh,
I think the answer will be different from both perspectives. As far as the Digambar sect is concerned, there is a minimum requirement of Dravilinga to attain Bhavlinga. For example, the quote was also saying to whom he was saying. The Kunda and other authors were saying to their Shishya and to their disciples who were already attaining the Dravilinga. So it was these statements are all for the people who do not just satisfied in Draviling itself. So somehow in Digambar perspective, Draviling is necessary to attain Bhavling. Whereas we see the contradiction or contrast perspective in Shwetambar tradition that needs further exploration. As I already mentioned, in the Shwetambar traditions, the ling are being categorized as Jinling, Nirgranthaling, Grahasthaling, and Anyaling also. So how Anyaling and Grahasthaling facilitates this function of being Draviling and to attain that Bhavling that needs the further exploration. For example, as far as I remember, the example of Maru Devi, she attains the liberation in the Grahasthaling itself. So how that foundation of Draviling will be necessary in that condition that needs the further exploration. How the Godistan framework works in that particular situations that needs the further exploration for that. So the answer will be different according to the both different sects, Digambar and Shwetambar traditions.
Yeah, thank you for that. And just actually one more thing that suddenly comes to mind, and again, here I'm thinking about the Shwetambar tradition. As you mentioned, at some point you had a long list of the ways in which Dravya and Bhav, this fundamental dichotomous categorization, not dichotomous, but binary categorization within the Jain tradition is found in all sorts of things. It emerges very much in the debates on Murti Puja between the aniconic Dundiya traditions and the Murti Puja traditions, with the defense of Murti Puja by Murti Pujik saying, we are embodied beings, and to understand the disembodied jina, we have to start with our own embodiment, that we can't start with the disembodiment because that's just not possible for us. So I don't know if that's ever been expressed in sort of moving from Dravya to Bhava, but it's another thing to look at as you're looking at this larger phenomenon of really the tension between the Jain ideal of a disembodied, immaterial jina and the fact that we are embodied material beings. And how do you get from the one to the other? I think is at the heart of so many aspects of Jain tradition. And I'll just give a plug for Peter that, his upcoming workshop next March in SOAS is on material culture. And so you might think about contributing something to that. Well, actually, there is, modern Jain has taken the Dravyalinga Bhavalinga discussion and applied it to Ashi's presentation. And I'll just add that, something Ashi mentioned it may not have noticed was the person she was discussing was given Diksha, if I understood you right, Ashi, at the very end of his life. And this is somewhat controversial. It's done in some traditions, and other traditions say no, that you can't take Diksha without extensive ritual, textual presentation. And if you want to sort of talk a little bit about the notion of a layperson doing it, or does the person have to then take Diksha so that their death is as a mendicant or a mendicant to be or something like that? Can you There's a question in there somewhere, Ashi. I'm not sure what I'm asking, but if you could address that.
Yes. So based on like the interview that I had,
Mm.
the intention behind taking Diksha for that person was that since he was already free from all the attachments, be it like in terms of like the family attachments or whatever he has achieved in his life,
Mm.
mentioned like even his degree as well. So he gave up all of that. And then it's considered, as per him, that it is considered that if you die, it's like Pandit Marna. So that kind of
Mhm.
is considered as the death of a wise if you have taken Diksha also along with Salekna. So I guess that's why they prefer to do it. But you're right, it's not very common among both the traditions. Some people take it
Mm.
and some people do not take it. Yeah.
Yeah.
In addition to the Bhavlinga, yeah, few departed souls people have taken Santara just around the time of death, even last few minutes. What are your thoughts on? Okay, that's a very good question, interesting question. But as per I think the as per Bhagavati Sutra, it doesn't matter like for how the time doesn't really matter for how long have you taken Salekna, but the intention behind it matters a lot. And again, like circling back to my interviews, there were some people who stopped eating and drinking because of their medical conditions, and some of them were not fully conscious as well, but still they
Mm.
chose to take Salekna when asked by the family members, because at that time their intention was to improve their present life as well as their mainly focus on the next life. Um, so again, like that time is just it's not, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Chris, do we have time for one more question?
Yes, I believe we do. Yes.
Okay, because I wanted to ask you a question. Jyoti, if you could sort of just describe for us, there are these, you say, these early modern vernacular Bhasha, texts, Tirthmalas and things like that. Just a little bit of, I mean, here you had people going from like Delhi and Agra all the way across North India and then into Jharkhand and all of that. What were these things like? These giant undertakings of monks and laymen and servants and armed guards and who knows who else was going along there.
Yeah. So I've worked with one text now. So most of these pilgrimage account and the Mughal revenue records I've been working with, there's a whole pilgrimage economy around these mobilities where there is imperial permissions involved. Every town, these pilgrimage group
Mhm.
would need imperial permissions from local rulers and from this one of this my account talks about permission from Jahangir, for which they had to wait for 1 month for the permission to be
Mhm.
granted imperial center, and then the negotiating with every stop they're going to stop at, and pilgrim taxation which has to be paid to local chieftains, and that created an pilgrimage economy where everyone had certain kind of shared spirituality, which was very much prominent in the landscape of Parasnath itself, where the kingdom of Balganj is involved. Himself is a very much part of that shared ritual authority, that the pilgrimage starts with the going to Raja's house and they pay the tax there, and then the Raja himself initiate this pilgrimage. Then the any pilgrimage group can actually climb the hill. So most of these travel accounts gives a very holistic picture that this pilgrimage was not just Jains, it involved everyone else, and it had
Yeah.
a administrative structure around it, administrative, political, economic, all three.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Thank you. And and the evident, and this is where Steve has talked about this, Steve Vose too, that these things didn't happen without the intimate collaboration of the Mughals and the other Islamicate rulers. And the Jains could do this because they played such central roles in both the economy and the administration of the Mughal state itself. So, there was a reciprocity there. Okay, I just wanted to say one final thing. I forgot to say it earlier. I want to thank all 5 presenters for being really concise and clear, and they were wonderful presentations that allowed us an entire hour of conversation. That's what's fun about these things. So I will now turn it over to, I don't know, one of the 3, Chris, Maria, Elaine, Tina, whoever wants to conclude all this.
Thank you, John. Yes, thank you so much for presiding over the event for us, John. It's a great honor to have your esteemed presence here and expertise to be able to navigate so many different topics. And of course, our wonderful presenters for bringing such an interdisciplinary panel on new research in Jain studies. So we really sincerely appreciate this. This was our 8th and final event in this academic year in the Dialogues in European Jain Studies speaker series. I just counted as we were finishing here that we had 27 scholars this year on this program. And so you 6 were our final 6 this year in the academic year. And it was a great honor to have so many scholars from Jain Studies and to conclude with this event. I also wanted to let you all know that next year we're already planning the next Dialogues in European Jain Studies speaker series. So stay tuned for that. And we look forward to seeing you next year when that happens. You'll see an announcement come from us in due time. So thank you all. And on behalf also of Marie Elaine and Tina Wekemans, my colleagues from University of Birmingham and Ghent University, we thank you also from Arihanta Institute for making this a successful event and for all of the audience participation as well throughout the year. We'll see you in the next academic year. Everyone have a wonderful summer. Jai Janendra, we'll see you next time.
Next time, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.